Well, hi there.
Welcome. Thank you all so much for joining today. My name is Kacie, Lett.
And I'm Robert Berris.
And we're from 352. Robert leads our innovation practice. Myself, I'm over our strategy practice. And we also have Kierra Greene from 352, who leads our partnership marketing. We appreciate you taking the time to join this afternoon. We have, I think, a really wonderful group lined up. Something like 45 people wanted to hear us wax poetic around innovation and design thinking, and that's flattering and exciting. So I do know that there's some ISP issues happening out there. We've heard that quite a few of the providers are down. So with that, want to just say if there's any sort of connectivity issues that you're having or others are having, we'll be sharing this out after the session today.
And because this is our first webinar, to be candid, we're not really sure if we like webinars. We have no idea.
No idea.
And so this is a little bit of an experiment for us, and we're going to test and learn a little bit today. We thought that perhaps some of the large group work that we do at EES, where we bring big speakers in and we have this event down in Midtown, we thought that might be tough for some of the people who maybe are more north of Midtown, and so we wanted to see if there was enough interest to have sort of a facilitated dialogue, in this type of format. So I'm not sure if it's a webinar, I'm not sure if it's a podcast, but what we do know is we're going to try to talk a little bit today, and then hopefully engage with you guys. And feel free to ask questions in the chat. We'll try to figure out how to unmute people, and maybe if you want to, sort of raise your hand, we can have a bit more of a dialogue. And so we're going to have some topics that we cover sort of later in the, later in the show. I don't even know what to call it.
Feel very excited about that.
Yeah, for sure. This is like a weird NPR show. With that, we'll get into kind of the main topic. So really today, design thinking, why it's the key to customer-focused innovation.
And for what it's worth, why this is important for us and why we wanted to do this is 352 as a company. We are a company that's really rooted in design thinking and human-centered design and helping companies and organizations really solve big problems. We say that we help companies do business better by focusing on problems over solutions and getting them really close to their customers so that they're solving things that matter. Robert, over his innovation practice, and that's really where a lot of the focus will be today, is talking about our community, as we mentioned, the Enterprise Entrepreneurship Series, as well as other facilitated groups that we have here in Atlanta, training and education that we do for a lot of our corporate partners, asking us to come in and help them kind of train the trainer. How do you make a culture of innovation? And finally, around our professional services and some of the anecdotes that we have, war stories, we joke sometimes therapy that we have from our time working with a lot of the enterprises. I think that probably some of you on the line are with today, and helping you say how it can design thinking really be the key to my customer-focused innovation. And what does customer-focused innovation mean, perhaps in both B2B and B2C worlds? So to Robert's point, we welcome conversation, dialogue. The reason we do this is for the community and to build it and have it be an active place where we can learn from each other. So without further ado.
Yeah, we'll just jump right in. So what we hope you get out of today is, at a high level, how to think about leveraging empathy for people and for solutions, how to think about problems a little differently, and how to think about design and experiments a bit differently. And we'll get into what each one of those mean. And then we have some other topics that we're going to throw out there sort of as a roundtable discussion that will kind of kick back and forth between Kacie and myself. And again, if anybody has something to contribute, definitely welcome the conversation and questions. So a lot of times when I give a talk, I talk about or ask people and try to make it interactive. I ask people about this particular scenario. And the scenario is, imagine you have a dentist practice, right? Or this guy is my friend who's a dentist. And, his business problem is that, he can't get customers to come back more than once every 18 months. But from we'll call it an oral health perspective, it would be great if he came back every 6 months. And obviously from a business perspective, he would triple revenue if he were able to get people to come in more often. And so what I ask people in these sort of talks, I'll ask them and say, hey, so if you were to come up with a solution that would help grow that business and resolve that problem, what would be a solution? And often what happens is that people come back and say, well, maybe it's a better looking waiting room. Or maybe it is, iPads that are, accessible while you're in the dentist chair. Or maybe it's really pleasant music.
Yeah, we've gotten, just thinking through some of the workshops, what if you were open odd hours? What if you were, in a commuter city and you needed to be open at 7 a.m. to 8 p.m.? We've talked about being able to create incentives and rewards programs. So tying into a lot of mental models that a lot of businesses use.
Yeah, and so super smart solutions, really enjoy all of them. And then really the next sort of activity we ask people to do is, and this is easier when you can see me, but imagine me, I generally wear some Converse.
Guys, he's a hipster.
Oh, no.
He's got glasses. He's got the curly hair.
Got a little beard.
Yeah, you can imagine.
I wear jeans a lot. It's a problem. And so generally we'll ask people, so tell me what type of car do you think I drive and tell me why. And there's actually trends, which I think is really funny about it. So I hear Prius a lot because I must care about the environment, or, I look like I like technology. I hear BMWs a lot because maybe I'm an executive and I, again, like higher tech, better, whatever manufactured cars. Because I live in town, I hear I maybe ride a bicycle, so I don't actually have a car. Or I'm just on bird scooters all the time. Like I just 100% of the time I'm on a bird scooter. And it's all really great. And so I use these two exercises to basically make the point that when you work in today's business world, especially for large organizations, oftentimes you're being asked in the moment to come up with solutions. And you're being asked to assume you know who your audience is. But generally what we see is that you're leveraging your bias and you're leveraging proxy knowledge of what you think your consumer wants or what your consumer does, instead of actually asking them what they do. And what we find is that most companies, it's been months or even years since they did some form.
Or never.
Or never. We hear never sometimes, yeah. Where they actually went out and talked to customers in the field and did so in a way to uncover problems that maybe they never heard about. Maybe the real issue at the dentist is that you were a kid and you had to have a cavity filled when you were 5 years old. And that was such a scary experience that forever, I guess, tainted your view of going to the dentist. So no waiting room optimization, no odd hours, no iPad, no television experience while you're at the dentist is going to make that better because it's a deep-rooted problem. And so often we're asking people, are you solving for a symptom or are you solving for a real problem?
To translate that into the business world, frequently I'm sure, I could probably get some smiles, head nods, maybe crying into your hands on the line of an executive or a stakeholder, or you yourself saying, we need more revenue or sales are down. Oftentimes it's tied to these very ROI driven things, and absolutely they're important. But to solve for, hey, we need more revenue. We were sitting in a meeting this morning and revenue was the focus. And when we tried to dig into why, oftentimes they're talking about a symptom and not a real problem. So for instance, the taxi industry could have said, we need more riders. Well, that's a symptom of people using taxis less. Instead, the problem may be there's now a new way to do this that gives transparency and ownership and disrupts a traditional mental model as well as business model for mass consumers. And no matter how many more riders we seek to attract, without touching on that transparency, the empowered consumer, we were never going to win that. And so we work a lot of times to really get down to the root cause and be able to articulate that and create buy-in across a company and the powers that be will say.
Sure. And that's really what design thinking is about, right? It's about going in and saying, look, we just want to be intellectually honest and say, we don't know maybe what the problems are. We may have a series of ideas in a backlog somewhere that have been gathered over time. And that's great that ideas exist, but I would argue ideas are cheap. Ideas are cheap because how do you know if an idea is actually a solution? And so a lot of times when we're talking about how do you start to do solutions and what does that look like from we'll just say from a business point of view, from an organizational point of view, what happens is that people often start with digital technology, right? Well, digital must be the solution, right? And you hear terms like digital transformation and business transformation, and I'm not saying there's no value to it. But I don't know if that's where you start, right? I mean, you could have a company that says, oh, we got to get off the paper system. Maybe. I don't know if the paper system is what's broken. I know you feel like it might be, but I don't know if it actually is.
Yeah, oftentimes we hear technology, especially when they're new disruptive technologies. I think AI, machine learning, blockchain. These are all that I've heard a lot about. We've done some exploratory work around them, and sometimes companies are saying, I need to figure out how it applies to my business. When instead, for digital technology, maybe I just need to have a perspective on it, and then I can think about my consumer problems, my business problems, and then work into a technology rather than leading with technology and working into a problem. The saying of everything becomes a nail when you have a hammer. Mm-hmm. And that very much is what happens when you start with technology. It's the new, the flashy, but maybe not always the most impactful.
Absolutely. And the flip side is, like, of course, you want to know about new technology. You want to know that there is a quote unquote strategy or tactic by which you could deliver a solution. And that would be a great way when you start thinking of solutions. But to just start and say we need augmented reality is a bit short-sighted, because, again, you're putting a solution ahead of what a problem might be. And then some companies say, you know what, we want to start with analytics and insights, right? So we have solutions that exist in the marketplace. We're looking at our analytics suite, or maybe we've done a quant study, whatever that might be, about an existing solution. And it goes back to our question of, is your solution actually solving for a symptom or a problem? What if the solution you have in the marketplace today is the wrong solution? Or what if it's an incomplete solution? And so by starting simply with analytics and insights and, leveraging that as the metric by which you say, hey, look, this is the evidence we have for X, Y, or Z. It gives me pause because, again, I just don't know what problem we may be solving for, and I don't know if there's enough efficacy around the idea that enough customer research has been done to suggest that this solution is actually, in fact, solving for a core problem. So for us, we're always looking at human behavior first. We're asking ourselves, if we go out into the world and we say, as design thinkers, if we want to unlock a great opportunity for our business, what does that look like? And it starts with talking to people. It starts with being open and saying, look, we don't know what we don't know, but there's value in that. There's true value in going out there almost with a blank slate and saying, if I ask a non-biased question and I can look at a consumer and the life and the behaviors that they lead, how does that intersect with my business versus how does my business intersect with the consumer to start? And I think that's a key difference in how you start thinking and solutioning. Then maybe there is some form of digital technology you put in front of it, or then maybe you use analytics and insights or maybe past solutions or maybe secondary research that would suggest, okay, based on behaviors that we're seeing in the marketplace, that's maybe something you can leverage. So then starting with human behavior becomes the core of how you start the solution. You get to real problems, and then leveraging technology or analytics and insights becomes a modifier or a lens by which you view solutions.
Yeah, to just add into that a little bit, sometimes I think that, you attend webinars or speaking sessions or workshops, and a lot of this is it's inspiring, it's engaging, it's, you get motivated by doing this. But then when you go back to your business, you start thinking about, well, I sell into the sales organization, right, or I have, these other operating models. And so human behavior starts to go away. And instead you're thinking about more the business unit, the mass audiences that you're supporting or servicing inside the company or outside the company. And instead, what we try to say is that no matter whether it's a business unit or an end consumer, they're all people, right? And that at the end of the day, if you start thinking about what their world looks like, you very quickly can start having more empathy. And I know that even just through some of the businesses we've worked with, that never have they probably ever thought about it in terms of what are the people we're serving. When you start to do that, it really becomes attainable and digestible. And so as you're operationalizing some of these thoughts back to your own organization, I would think about the people that you're supporting, not just the business unit or the overarching business goal.
Yeah, super fair. So again, we're always coming back to this question because it's a reminder: are you solving for a symptom or a problem? Right? That really is the key to really unlocking and thinking about what design thinking is. So just to give it a little bit more color, so we define design a little differently. Many organizations think about design in the form of, well, it's pretty, or it's the structure by which you put form to function. We define it a little differently. We like to say that, number one, everyone's a designer, and you are, because it's the practice of solving business challenges. It's not art. It's not subjective in that way. I mean, there's a very specific reason that you're trying to solve a problem, right? But a solution needs to be a response to a well-defined problem. If you don't know the problem that you're solving for and it's murky, you probably aren't ready for a solution yet. You probably aren't ready to go to market with something and test. So by having a well-defined problem and using empathy, that is really the practice of doing design. And from a design thinking perspective, this is a very common model that you're seeing on screen. There's all sorts of other mental models of double diamonds and things like that. At the end of the day, it comes down to understanding, exploring, and learning. And so if we can empathize with the people we're trying to understand, that could be internal to your organization or external. If we can then use that empathy and uncover and define problems, we can then begin to ideate against them. And then by doing so, we're not just ideating in a vacuum. We're not just doing it for the sake of ideas and having a pipeline. Instead, what we're saying is, look, we have a bunch of ideas. We think these meet the following criteria because we have this well-defined problem, and we're willing to then put some time to prototype. When we talk about prototyping, it doesn't have to be that complicated. It doesn't have to be more than a day or two of work. We want to put lightweight experiments out into the world in a controlled environment and get responses and feedback from people. And by observing them and seeing how they use this solution, now they're actually using what I would argue is an experience. And without doing that and without having that sort of testing and learning cycle, it becomes very challenging for large organizations to kind of move the needle to be able to find incremental wins or, more importantly, even moonshots.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that if I can kind of gut check us here is we've asked or given a lot of information. And guys, like we said, this is our first webinar. And so we want to turn the floor over to see if there is any interest within the chat or questions specifically to get some information back from the group. And you can simply put in the chat or questions area some of the things you might be wanting to understand or talk about. Or if you say, I have a question, then we'll click on you, unmute you, and you can chat with the group. So anybody have feedback there or anything to add, we'll pause for a moment.
I feel like we need music for this, like a little...
I would try to sing, but I think everyone would log off.
No. We don't want to do that.
Yeah. All right. Everybody's going at once, it seems.
All right. Fair enough. All right. So we'll get back into it. Often what we talk about when we're trying to figure out how to convey the difference between more of an experimental mindset and one that involves testing and learning, one that involves kind of quicker wins around experimentation and around learning, we talk about knowledge over time. And what it boils down to is for many of our large organization clients that we work with, many of them view risk in a really specific way. And so that way generally is that the longer it takes to plan something, the longer it takes to write specifications and business requirements, the more likely that project will be successful. They think it's successful because the more time that you spend and apply to that, they think that it's going to be better thought out. They think it's going to be adverse to risk. And I can understand where that mindset comes from, right? It makes a lot of sense. The more you plan for something, the less likely it would be to fail. The difference is that we work in a world where the world's moving too quickly. Human behavior is changing. You have major technology partners in the world like Google and Facebook and Amazon who are building solutions all of the time that consumers are now interacting with. And so no matter if you're in the flooring industry or you're working in the paper industry or you work in background checks, whatever that might be, the challenge you have is that consumer behavior is changing with or without you. And so we would argue that there's actually a much greater risk of building a solution over a long period of time and then only putting it into the market to learn that it was the wrong solution. So now you've spent potentially millions of dollars building this thing, but you haven't validated that that was the thing that people wanted. And I use the word thing because what you built maybe wasn't a solution. If a solution is a response to a well-defined problem and you put something in the marketplace no one wants, what did you build? So the way we look at it is that there's a way, which there is, and design thinking is one methodology that can be used. If there's a way to put something into the market really quickly and to learn in a few days what perhaps it would take you 6 months to learn if you had to build it out as a full solution, there's definitely a lot of value to that. And organizations who view risk through that lens, I think this is a hard mental switch for them.
Yeah, I think also that traditionally they're not incentivizing the people that are doing a lot of this work around long-term versus short-term, or or rather short-term knowledge versus long-term gain. A lot of times when you think about this, people are saying, if I'm planning, then I don't have to do. And if I don't do, I don't fail. And by the way, if you fail in my company, then you aren't successful. Therefore, if somebody's keeping, job trends would say 18 to 36 months, that right here looks at the timeline that they're going to be planning and doing, and a lot of activity, but maybe not productivity. And I think that as, leaders in organizations, we have to come and realize that the way we're incentivizing people, departments, employees is actually causing us to be hamstrung when it comes to innovating, because we're so worried about getting to this Q, the second Q3 here, rather than truly getting knowledge. And I think that, you think about very traditional parts of the organization, whether it's legal or risk, some of these where planning is really requested or required. You're not bringing them into this process. And so therefore, of course, they're going to be incentivized and promoted to do this. It's just competing initiatives. And I think that sometimes, we're brought in to say, okay, help us get somewhere quickly, but we're not realizing all the other immunities within the organization that could, keep us from being able to gain that fast knowledge. And so one thing when it comes to design thinking is it can't be done in a vacuum. It has to be something that's, ownership across the organization, and maybe bringing in divergent perspectives, or even people that are resistant to it. Sometimes, resistance is such a great asset to have, because if you're able to get that person or that department or that part of the organization bought in, then therefore you're removing a barrier early on, rather than having to run up against it full steam ahead and, maybe in a couple of quarters.
Absolutely. So when we think about solutioning, one of the hardest and maybe last pieces to really touch on about building a solution is that, within the innovation timeline, you generally have explore, pilot, and commercialize. And what ends up happening is that the explore phase is really messy. And often people are adverse to the messiness of that. But the messiness really just comes from that you're not building full-on solutions. You're not building something that has to go live in the world, and you're willing to put what appears to be, some stringing cans together to simulate a phone. Or you're willing to put an iPad that has a flat and static, interface on it, and you're willing to put that into some sort of cardboard, looking device, and maybe that's a kiosk at a movie theater, right? And you're able to do that and observe how people work with it, but it doesn't have to be perfect. And so I think the exploration phase of, really defining problems, understanding what people are going through, and then testing and learning and really investing and pivoting and killing those ideas, I think that's a pretty foreign concept for a lot of organizations. I would then argue that, piloting a program doesn't have to be perhaps such a large endeavor that many companies make it to be. So you could have a smaller market test, and that market test could be something as simple as, hey, look, we have 100 consumers we want to interact with in one of our stores, and we're a grocery store. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a small pilot in 1 or 2 stores, and we're going to get some feedback, and we're going to learn. When we validate that and we start to build out the pilot program, and we're always iterating on what we're learning, then it's time to commercialize. And I think what ends up happening, and we see this all the time, is that people come to us when they're ready to commercialize, but they haven't done any of the exploration, they haven't done any piloting. And so at that point in time, they're essentially ready to spend $500,000 to $1 million on a solution, whether it's software or not. There's still very little efficacy around the fact that this is a proven solution that's going to work in the market. It's just that, hey, we've done enough research internally and we have enough buy-in from stakeholders to suggest this is what we want. We're the expert of our customers, but we haven't spoken to any of them. So it's a scary concept that perhaps solutioning in general has not been maybe as efficacious or as holistic as it could be, because people are just sort of generally focused on getting to the end state of a solution rather than being a little bit more iterative and thoughtful about, hey, we don't know what we don't know, but let's be really lean about how we build things as opposed to building too much. So at the end of the day, when we look at innovation opportunity with design thinking, what we're really talking about is, look, there's some knowns that we know and can plan for, right? Those exist within our organization. Some of it's proxy knowledge, some of it is exact knowledge in that, hey, these are the areas in which we plan. These are the areas that we want to, as a portfolio of innovation, improve. But the flip side is there's some unknowable unknowns, right? And the analogy I like to give is that, 40 years ago, if you asked someone what they thought about coffee, or what they liked about coffee or disliked, they might say sometimes it's too hot, sometimes it's too bitter. I'd like a bigger cup. I'd like a cup that, keeps my coffee warm all the time. What you might not get out of it is I want to have a 2-pump, non-fat, no-whip white mocha. right?
That's Robert's actual coffee order.
That is not my coffee drink. I promise. I promise it's not. But the answer is like, how would you know, right? How would you have ever known that maybe 20 years ago, if you ask someone, to Kacie's point about the taxi cab industry, how would you have known that people might be open to a rideshare model? Right? So they're open to a model where they're going to jump into a stranger's car, of which as a child, many of us were told never go into a stranger's car, especially if there's candy. And now we accept the fact that there's mints and waters in a stranger's car that we're summoning on our phone. And so there are these mental models that you just don't know if people are ready for. Some of it's based on context, but you're not going to find that out necessarily in just a traditional research method. And so by focusing on the unknowable unknowns and going out into the world and saying, we don't know what people are plagued by, but we think we can at least isolate certain experiences and talk to people about what it's like to go through them, there's some opportunities for success that we just may not have known. And whether that's adjacent or, aligned exactly with the business that you have today, that may be an unknown, but that's where a lot of opportunity lives.
Any questions here from the group? I know that, these things can be sometimes difficult to engage with, but for those of you that have been to our events, we really do try to make this a dialogue. We learn from the community just as much as we hope that you all learn from us. So any thoughts or feedback on this? I always like to hear from people that either this is completely new and I've never heard about this and how do I operationalize it, all the way to people who say, yeah, I'm super familiar with this and either I've been successful or here have been my roadblocks, and being able to share maybe some of those war stories or perspectives. So I'd just be curious, is there any feedback from the group? And if not, that's okay too, but would love this to be a little bit more collaborative. Going once, going twice, folks.
Oh, do I see a hand raise? Is that what that thing is? Let's see. I see Parker. All right. Lower this attendee's hand. All right, one moment here. Let me see if I can allow. Let's see here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
Can you hear me? Oh, great. Thank you. Just a question. I think for companies that have a history of being consumer focused, and have a direct connection with consumer behavior, consumer engagement, and understanding how to get into the consumer's mind and engaging with them, and then crafting products and services around those needs, whether it's B2B or B2C. This seems to be a bit redundant. Not that you personally created design thinking, but just the concept and the whole concept of empathy. So it seems to me that this model is most effective for companies that have not been consumer facing and consumer focused, and or also a team that does not necessarily have the experience of business planning and strategic product planning for their target audiences. Would you say that's true, or are you seeing these requests coming from organizations that it's pretty surprising? I mean, I'm a little surprised at, and this is in my first, time with a concept of design thinking, but it seems a little elementary in a sense, but maybe for the audience of the companies that really need it, it is elementary.
I think that's a fabulous question. Thank you for asking it. And I don't know your specific organization or kind of background there, but you're spot on. I mean, design thinking is born out of product design, industrial design, and that world. What we have found, so, there's a couple parts of your question is, do we think that it's for companies that aren't necessarily customer centric or maybe don't have a really sophisticated product offering? I think that often those parts of the organization, and whether it's we certainly have experience working with very sophisticated consumer goods companies, consumer products companies, that design thinking lives within maybe that R&D or product development department. But as you start permeating other parts of the organization, finance, HR, employee development, go to market, and especially as it pertains to disruption, where sometimes it causes reactive behavior instead of more proactive. That is where we see a need to build this discipline independent of maybe what you're speaking about. There certainly are companies that are practicing this and practicing it at scale, and those I think are those that are the shining example for a lot of where the varied maturity models are seeking to go. But and I may have, if there's any of your question that I've forgotten there, please let me know. But I would say that it's often applying this thinking to maybe more conservative parts of the organization, or some that are not always as traditionally close to the actual customer, that might be more operating on more traditional maybe business models. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
yeah, it does, and it's. Can you guys still hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, we can still hear you.
But yeah, this is interesting in that I'm noticing, especially for folks that are actually new to the workspace, new to brand building and building service and products. This is probably extremely helpful for them. But for those that have deep marketing experience, deep strategic business planning, this is this is the core of how you think about it and how you need to engage in your organization to embrace it, and then therefore reflect that in your consumer offering, and then get back the value from that. But anyway, no, thanks. I don't want to disrupt you guys, but I'm always kind of scratching my head on some of it. I'm just like, yeah, it's like we learned this in business school.
Yeah,
and we learned it when,
No.
Yeah, sorry.
No. Don't, please no apologies. No, this is great. So what's really weird, and I agree with you, right? It does seem like it's sort of 101. What's weird is that many of our clients, even if they have very, we'll call it experienced, and I'll call it like long-term strategic planning or insights and strategy departments, this is still a foreign concept. It's not foreign to talk to consumers. I think the methodology by which you do so in a rapid way, I think the ability to build solutions that are much faster, as opposed to, and it's hard, right? If you're building physical products, it seems difficult sometimes to think that way. But I would say more than half of our customers that we work with are directly facing consumers. And this thinking is still a new way for them. It's not completely brand new, but it definitely is not the way they're behaving today. And I could also make an argument that traditional brands, and this is very common, of course, in advertising, you look across a 1-year cycle of sort of what I'll call strategic planning, right? So you might say, hey, Q3 is our strategic planning quarter. We're going to present, internally, externally, this is the thing we're going to do. And then for the next year, this is our strategy. Oftentimes, there's no ability to even change that strategy or to think what I'll say in maybe shorter cycles. So in my opinion, there's still a lot of what I'll call traditional behaviors that are, I'll say, disabling companies from being a bit more successful. And what I agree with you should be like, yeah, of course, why wouldn't we be doing that? So I think the head scratching or confusion is very fair. But I think it's still shocking when, this is still sort of new and exciting for certain organizations. Any other questions? Okay. I don't see any other hand raises. Okay. And so really the final thing we're going to talk about just within this sort of slide thing was just this last one. And so a lot of what we're talking about when it comes to design thinking at the end of the day is just saying, how do we go from proxy knowledge to actual knowledge? How do we get closer to understanding who this sort of shadowy figure is, who is our consumer, and how do we start to build a little bit more detail around that person, whether it's through customer journey maps, empathy maps, personas, primary research, whatever that might be. How do we get closer and closer to an end state where we understand who they are? And not only do we understand who they are, but we actually have solutions that they are giving us feedback on much faster than traditional, what I'll call product cycles, where you may be waiting a year to bring something to market, so that you have an inkling if this is, truly a product that's viable for them. So what we wanted to do was try to open this up more for discussion, and we thought we had a couple of different topics we wanted to cover. And I'm just going to go through some of those, but this does require a little bit of participation. So Kacie and I are going to kind of riff on some of these for about 5 minutes each, and then try to see if we can get some additional questions like the one we just had, which was great. So we really do welcome the discussion. A couple that were on our list, we talked about how do you accelerate learning, perhaps what are some ways of testing and applying that knowledge, how do you operationalize insights within organizations, and then maybe even talking a little bit about failure and risk definition. So I don't know, Kacie, I'll just leave it up to you. Like, what would be one that you'd want to talk about? And then again, we can open it up for questions after we discuss for a little bit.
Let me look closer at my list here.
Okay.
I think we've talked a little bit about the accelerating learning around the knowledge over time. I think that the operationalizing of insights is always something that I think is maybe seems a little easier in theory. Like we're going to get this learning and then we're going to apply it.
Yeah.
But the sometimes the politics, sometimes the just process and procedure. I mean, heck, sometimes the regulation, right? You could have this great insight on how to add value. But I think that if we can talk about the operationalizing of insights and then maybe getting into what do insights really mean and how do those come to be out of testing and learning, testing and applying those to the business. I think those could be really two good areas to get into and maybe give some tangible examples of what we mean.
Okay, sure. So why don't we just talk about high level, some real client examples. So one of our clients is in the manufacturing space. They physically do not produce a direct-to-consumer product, but they have other B2B partners who do, and so they essentially make, we'll call it a fiber or some sort of, not molecule, but some sort of thing that's then used in an end-state process. And so what they do have to do and what they are tasked with is driving pull-through demand. So they do have a brand that's recognizable to consumers. But again, someone else makes the final product that's actually in your home. One of the challenges that we observed, working with them, not only in the work that they were doing on their own, because they were doing, essentially a year worth of research. One of the things that we had seen was that they were including us on several of their, what I'll call downloads of insights. And we sat through a 3.5-hour presentation where they went through all of the things they had learned through focus groups, through co-creation workshops. And at the end of it wasn't really clear what to do. And we started talking to some of our stakeholders as in how might we actually operationalize the insights that were just shared. We started talking about, what is the priority and how do we know that? And what our clients were telling us was that we have no idea what to do with this, right? We're provided a 150-page slide deck, in the form of a PowerPoint, and we see the insights, but we actually don't know how to move it forward. Many of us work in strategy. Many of us, don't have teams that allow us to, move ideas forward. And what are we supposed to do with that? We also, in our own work, as we've been doing, different, we'll call it rapid prototyping, design sprints, workshops, we also found that we would have these sort of longer, presentations, maybe not quite 3 hours, maybe 45 minutes to an hour. And we saw that our clients weren't able to use these. I mean, we had learned stuff that was as simple as if you remove these 3 or 4 barriers from a user experience standpoint on your site today, you could actually sell 2x more product if you could do that. And so what we started to find was that to operationalize insights, it came down to, honestly, a cadence. And it came down to bite-sized concepts, right? So being able to then sit down at the table with different business units and really helping coaching the head of strategy for that group and saying, hey, look, guys, we can't just do a massive download. We actually have to do much more incremental changes. And by doing so, we were using essentially bite-sized concepts and facilitating a session with different business leaders to say, how might you apply this to your business? And how might you do so in the next 30 days? Because what we're looking for are incremental revenue wins, and we see 4 or 5 opportunities here across all of you with this one key insight. So that's just kind of an anecdotal piece of the puzzle about how we've seen, essentially the mode of just the big presentation, the mode of saying, here it is, but we've consistently seen actually with clients where nothing is changing. Kacie, I know you had a couple of other points within this construct of a conversation you might want to bring up.
Yeah, no, I think that was, thanks for getting into that, and you're closer to a lot of the specific client examples, so that's always good to have more hands-on. So for me, the insights I think are operationalizing them. So insights are learnings to our business. And I think those can come in a lot of different ways. This topic of today's conversation is specifically around design thinking, and design thinking for us is getting very close to customers. So hopefully it's consumer insights, right? That's the kind of the connective thread here. I think that, what happens is often these insights are taken into maybe the actual insights group, maybe market research, maybe into the product line. But there's often maybe the sales organization, customer support. There's other pieces of the pie, I'll say, that are not always included in that operationalizing of those insights. And so you have that infused into the product. It's put in marketing messaging. But then the people or the organization who is closest to the customer or incentivized to do things in maybe a traditional way because of quarterly compensation or bonus, I'm thinking a bit of sales there, wasn't into the conversation. And I don't know how many of us love when somebody decides something completely independent of you, comes over and says, hey, what if you go to a restaurant and they just said, hey, I thought you wanted this chicken. And you're like, no, I'm a vegetarian. You'd probably feel super frustrated. And so what we try to, coach a lot of our clients on is getting those parts. So kind of, if you think about the leverage points or linchpins in a lot of the operationalizing of this, and operationalizing it for us means putting it into real use. What are the different touch points? And so thinking about similar to how you would almost a customer journey, thinking about what is the internal journey of that, and getting those people involved, getting those resources or departments, and letting them feel a sense of ownership. When there's buy-in and collaboration and ownership, there then is a better output. Sometimes I think that this is taken as a warm and fuzzy. Mm-hmm. People think of, okay, gosh, we have to go to another workshop. We have to do another roundtable. But the value of this kind of work is really going through the process and letting the value reveal itself. And I think that often we're guilty of it in a 60-person company. I can only imagine in a 30,000-person company, for instance, of the challenges. But the nature of saying, I have to hit pause and I have to get the right people on board, and that's the only way it's going to be operationalized. That's just anecdotally, and this, getting really close to the actual people around it.
And so, I think we'd love to hear from the group, either one, do you have challenges around operationalizing insights, or two, what are some effective ways that you've been able to operationalize them? All right, we got one from John. A second here, John.
You guys hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. Hey, I'm with it's kind of an answer to Parker's question as well. And Parker, if you're still out there, hey man, this is a priesthood. I've come to believe. We know these things. We believe these things. And the Stanford Design School came up with this concept in the late 40s. It is out there. It's operational. The problem, I think, to answer your question, Kacie, is that all you can do is demonstrate. And you can certainly enforce actions to the people that work for you, beneath you. And all you can do, though, is demonstrate to the people above you that this stuff is it's working, and it's a methodology that will eventually bring success. You can't. There's no other way to convince anyone that's not going to want to use it, that isn't just going to listen to themselves and believe what they think their gut tells them, or that this is how a thing has been done before. With showing them, hey, I've got all this raw data, because you're right, we've learned it all in the same places, and we've kept, we've used it in the same places, and when it's been successful, it's worked, it's self-reinforcing. When it's not, they're convinced there has to be something else, and the reality is, I think you just need to stay at it and hope that eventually you convince the people above you to stay on the path, which is a hard sell, because then you're back to, you're believing me just because I say so, which makes it kind of a priesthood, I think.
John, what are some of the things that you've had to do in your organization to, I guess, get people past the point of just trust me and believe me? Like, how have you essentially created buy-in to do that?
Gosh, that's good, Austin. Part of it is it's you're always on. Part of it's performance. Part of it is an act. You have to be positive. You have to, but you have to speak the language. You have to make sure that your processes are repeatable, so that there's other people can track metrics and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. They're spending this resource, whether it's dollars or bodies or time, they're spending this resource to try and acquire this thing. I'm okay with that as long as there's some type of monthly or quarterly check that shows that they're just not off in la la land and making stuff up. And I think eventually it shows, your value shows vis-a-vis other parts of your organization, no matter how big or small it is, that you have validity. Your validity then gives you credibility, and that's it. It's just, when there's bad news to tell, you got to be right up front and talk about the bad news as well as the good stuff. Otherwise, if you don't have credibility, it doesn't matter how great you sound on paper. No one's gonna want to follow you.
Totally fair. No, thanks, John. Those are great insight and question. Anyone else have any comments or questions around how they may have operationalized insights before, or some challenges around doing it? Okay. So the next topic I think we wanted to try to cover, and looking at the time here, I think we probably have time for maybe one more or two more topics. We're at 12:45. One was around sort of the testing and applying of insights. And so just to kind of kick off the conversation again, one of the things that we've found is that, and keeping in mind the history of our company was that software development was a key component, right? It was for about 15, 16 years that was the key service line that we were providing. And over time, what we found was that more and more of the larger organizations we were working with didn't really know what solution they needed to create, but instead needed to say, hey, look, we still need to uncover some problems. We need to do more research and strategy before we're actually jumping to software as a core part of our business. And I think what we learned along the way was that the testing and applying of, I see we have some answer questions here. Okay. The testing and applying of that, we'll call it that insight, wasn't viewed to have a lot of value. We had people who just wanted to short circuit the process and jump right directly to, let's just make the solution. And so I think there's a bit of a, maybe, I don't know if it's cultural, I don't know if we're just taught it from the start, but I think there's definitely a tendency to say, we have enough insight, let's just jump from high level research to solution, and let's get there quickly, because we think that's the measure of success once we have a solution out there. And so what we found is it's actually pretty difficult, and it's a big mind shift to get everyone on board with the idea that testing and learning is an important component of the solutioning process, but maybe more importantly that failure is great. And I say failure in the sense of, hey, we tested an idea, it was the wrong idea. But guess what we learned from it? And it just seems like the value that comes from that is very clear to us, but becomes a little bit more challenging for some organizations. Kacie, it looked like you were thumbing through questions that were in that.
I am.
Okay.
I have one here. So it says, how do you handle differences in human behavior when there's no clear pattern?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Let's see. How do you handle differences? Okay. Well, what we've had to find is that there's a couple of different ways of looking at it, and I wish I had a little bit more context. So I don't know who asked the question, but perhaps they could raise their hand at some point on the Hangout, and we could talk. It's Maggie. Yep. So at some point, Maggie, maybe you could just click on the little button that sort of raises your hand, and we can have a little bit more of a discussion around it. One of the things that we've found when human behavior is really inconsistent is that sometimes what we're trying to do is figure out a different lens by which a product would be. Let's see here.
Maggie, I think you're on the line.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I'm in a loud place, but I think it was more around, especially when you're doing initial insights or gathering or observations, it's not clear what the patterns are, or maybe you see 2 or 3 different patterns. Is that when you start building 2 or 3 different exploration pilots, or like how do you handle the diversity that you're naturally going to see among humans and make something out of it? I guess that's really where my head was.
Yeah, sure. So I guess to maybe break it down to how we might start and then, of course, stumble upon that. So I would say that a lot of the work that we do is trying to say, number one, as an organization, that we're working with, what do we think the problems are that exist within the consumer experience, right? And essentially, why is there a need or a market opportunity or a problem that exists? The second part is to start to create, and I'm sure there's something similar to this for you guys, is that there's some sort of learning agenda. And you're saying to yourself, okay, these are the things that we want to learn. Some of these are hypotheses, some of these are just outcomes. But as you start to interview more and more customers, I think that's where you start to see the divergence, right? You start to see, wow, like this has nothing to do with what we thought about. And so for us, it comes down to a little bit before that, how are you valuing problems that you find? How are you valuing essentially the differences in human behavior that allow you to say, wow, I had no idea someone behaved that way. Is this even within our purview to start looking at and solving for? And if all of that is true, then to your point, what we start to do is we say, great, let's prioritize a better learning and testing plan to then say, all right, there are these 3 things that we observed. We now may need to do even more customer discovery and interview like another 20 people, and hopefully we're finding more information about that piece of behavior. But let's start testing against that, and let's start trying to figure out if someone is more likely to buy a bicycle online than they are, again, I'm just riffing here, than they are in a store, even though a bicycle is a large piece of equipment that theoretically you want to touch, feel, and hold, but for some reason they're more likely to do it online. Maybe there's other, we'll just say, learning agendas that have to be created from that. So then you do diverge, right? You have to diverge, but you still have focus on one, we'll just say, set of patterns you see, and then maybe a second set of patterns. I think what's a little tricky, because it's all abstract and this is all theoretical, is being able to start to say, how do you essentially code your research and your insights to then say, okay, we have these 3 things. Why are we pursuing each of them? How do they align with our business, and how do they align with why we value problems? A lot of times organizations don't define what makes a problem viable to them. Sometimes it's about scale, right? Sometimes it's about capability. Sometimes it's about adjacent businesses. It becomes a little tricky, so I feel like I'm going down too theoretical of a path. So let me just pause for a second and see if this is at all helpful, or we're just getting more lost in the weeds. And I don't know if we've lost Maggie. I see her, but I don't know if we can hear her.
Oh. Yeah, it's okay. Don't worry. I do think it's probably more of a theoretical question, so don't worry. I think you're doing fine.
Okay.
Aw, that was nice.
First piece of user feedback.
Yes, indeed. I think that some of that as well, Maggie, is being able to prioritize some of the feedback, and then also aligning that with like impact to effort. We talk a lot about that. Is you're going to get really varied things, and sometimes you might hear something that really affirms what you're thinking or really disproves it, but being able to find trends and maybe get to some of the core themes that aren't direct pieces of feedback, but there's some commonalities, and then seeing how, if you were to deliver on those, how you might track your impact to effort, and then versus your outcome. Mm-hmm. And is it ownable for you as a company? Those are all pieces of it, and pieces of kind of the exploration journey. Mm-hmm. I would say, if that's helpful.
I see there's some other questions where you, I see there's a few other questions. Let's see here. Let's see if we can do this one.
I think we have a comedian on the line. So no, I don't think we have any other questions here.
Okay.
From what I can understand, I think those are some just immediate feedback.
Oh, I see. Okay.
From people as we were going on. Anything else from the group? Anybody want to raise a hand and add any other commentary here? We are at the last 8 minutes of our time today. I want to be mindful of everyone's time and be sure to close this out well. Anything else? All right.
Okay.
Well, Robert, were there any other pieces here that you wanted to touch on as it pertains to test, apply, insights, accelerated learning? For those of you, if we haven't already said it, right there, that's kind of our tagline as a company, the things that we do and help with every day.
I would just say the last part is just around the testing and applying of knowledge. And I think if I can leave you with no other thoughts than just to say the following, I think a lot of times we as an industry, and I say industry, almost all industries are focused on some sort of perfect solution. And I think the more we can get to a point in time where we feel like we're good with a perfect solution today, but knowing that tomorrow it has to be different and tomorrow it has to be different, I think that will probably, it would ease tensions if everyone could agree and align on that. But two, I think it's just a healthier mindset when you're trying to solution something, right? I mean, there was a point in time in my career where all I was about was ideation and getting to solutions and understanding that over time, if I could fall in love with a great problem, that had so much more value and benefit to the organizations I worked for. And I was less married to the solution, right? I mean, we generally work with, people who are having to, I'll just say, change that mindset, right? It's like, yes, I recognize this might not be the right solution, but it feels like maybe you're in a state of completion, or it feels like you've reached an end state when you actually have a solution that's final. But unfortunately, the reality is solutions are rarely final, right? Solutions are something that have to evolve over time, and that's just the nature of the beast. And so I think, again, if you're more open to the concept of lower fidelity, types of prototypes, and again, that could be a service, a process, a concept, something digital, something physical, I think you'll learn so much more in such a short amount of time that I think the value you can bring back to an organization is rather shocking. And again, that's about operationalizing some insights, but some of it is just simply about operationalizing a new mindset, being able to introduce that into probably areas of the company they just never had to do that in. So anyway, that would just be a closing thought for me. Kacie, I don't know if you have any others.
No, I really I appreciate everyone joining today. I really appreciate the comments, the questions, the feedback. I think that we heard from maybe a couple of different perspectives, as well as maybe innovation maturities and different experiences. So I really appreciate it, and I hope this was of value. We welcome any feedback on the topics that we discussed today. Design thinking, I think to your point, Parker, this is certainly an established concept and something that a lot of organizations are familiar with. And hopefully this gave maybe another layer deeper into how it can be applied to an innovation strategy. Coming up in future webinars, our goal will be to approach similar topics like this, but then be able to peel back the onion, get in a little bit more, and hopefully give some really tangible examples. Less workshop style because we're all virtual, but hopefully some interactivity there. That's it for me. That's all I have. Thank you all so much for attending, and this will be shared out in the coming days, so you can have it to digest in your own time.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.